Hi there and welcome to my March wrap, in which I reflect on both the quantity and the quality of the books I read this month. Now, in terms of quantity, it was a good month, particularly if one bears in mind that I'm working 6 days a week and going to class. I read 5 novels, 40 short stories, 1 play, and 7 critical works, those being book chapters and journal articles. Full details are on my website, link in the description, but let's begin by talking about the novels I read. The first 2 novels came in a double-decker edition from Barnes & Noble, The Enchanted Castle and 5 Children and It by Edith Nesbit, regarded as the first modern writer for children. Of these 2 works, The Enchanted Castle was much the stronger, and I'll be reviewing it, all being well, in April. Since reading them, I've been delving into a biography of Nesbit, and I was fascinated to learn that the curious combination of classical culture and dinosaurs one finds in the Enchanted Castle is the direct product of her childhood visits to the relocated Crystal Palace, where she was able to observe the wonders of the Greek court and the dinosaur sculptures in the garden, which are still standing today. Next up was Kobo Abe's The Boxman, which I mention only for the sake of completion. It was absolutely wretched. About 2/3 of the way through, the narrator, whoever they were, simply admitted they had absolutely no idea what was going on, which was great because neither did I. I struggled gamely to the end, but this was by far the weakest of the 3 Abe fictions I've read. Next was Knut Hamsun's Dreamers, a far more straightforward novel, only 100 pages or so long, set in an isolated fishing village and centering on the romantic adventures of its protagonist. It was absolutely wonderful. Can't recommend it enough. I spent perhaps 4 hours reading this, and they were the most pleasurable 4 hours of the entire month. Finally, last night I finished another novel by the Scottish writer Muriel Spark. This time it was her Loitering with Intent. This was written during the 1980s, but it felt much more dated, probably due to its setting being the 1950s. It provides a highly fictionalized account of Spark's struggles to make it as a writer. The narrator is delightfully spiky. There are some excellent characters. However, it never really rises above the level of being a sophisticated piece of entertainment. It's not a patch on her The Driver's Seat, which I previously reviewed on the channel. Moving on to the short stories I read this month, the majority of them came from 3 collections by Pirandello, Heinrich von Kleist and Catherine Mansfield, respectively. If we speak about Pirandello first, some of these stories were absolutely magnificent. Link to this book in the description. I'll just pick out a few that particularly impressed me. Firstly, Bitter Waters, where the protagonist has such an amazing tale that he actually relocates for a number of months each year simply to be able to tell it to anyone who will listen in that particular location where the events took place. Absolutely wonderful. Then there is the tragedy of a character, where Pirandello is approached by a character from a weaker author's work who begs for Pirandello to take him into his own fiction and exploit him more fully. Pirandello actually refuses, but what a great idea. And finally, a classic of nihilism, Destruction of a Man. I won't say too much about it because that would be to spoil its pleasure, but it deeply impressed me. What an absolutely amazing writer Pirandello is. Okay, let's say a little now about von Kleist. Heinrich von Kleist was one of the leading figures of German Romanticism, and in his short life he produced numerous plays, and the 8 short stories gathered together in this collection. He died in 1811 as part of a suicide pact, having first shot dead a terminally ill woman and then turning the gun upon himself. Nothing could have prepared me for the shattering effect these stories would have on me. There is a fanatical quality to these tales that I simply haven't found anywhere else, and they were deeply influential upon Kafka, and for me they're a kind of weird mix of the historical fiction of Sir Walter Scott of the bureaucratic nightmare of Kafka and of the antiquarian ghost stories of M.R. James, three of my favourite writers. They absolutely are that good. I'll link to this collection in the description. Now, the first story, The Earthquake in Chile, really had me hooked, but it was Michael Kohlhaas, a 100-page story which impressed me the most. It's about one man's quest for justice at any price, even at the price of his life. And after reading it, I confided in a German friend of mine that in all of the books I'd read, Michael Kohlhaas was the figure with whom I most closely identified, and he just laughed and he said, "Jason, I knew it. Justice at any price." Indeed. What a fantastic discovery this is. The third collection I read was by Catherine Mansfield. Titled Bliss, this is the second volume of the 3 Mansfield published during her lifetime. Sadly, it was not as good as her debut collection, In a German Pension. There were no stories here that surpassed those in terms of quality, so something of a disappointment. Undeterred, I read the title story of her final collection, The Garden Party, and again, I wasn't that impressed. However, after a week or so of reflection on this seemingly simple story, I have developed a different view, and there is a considerable amount going on under the surface, just as well, because in 10 weeks I'll have to give a lengthy presentation about it in class. Okay, let's speak briefly about the single play I read this month. This was The Winter's Tale by Shakespeare, and what I'm about to do is an act of heresy on booktube, but I'm going to point you towards a production by the Globe Theatre that you can watch rather than read the text itself. That's because this play is just so long that every time it's produced for the stage, much of the fat is cut away, and what you're left with is a far more enjoyable aesthetic experience. Okay, onto the critical works. I'm not going to name them, but it was chiefly about Catherine Mansfield this month. You can find the full details, as I said, on my website. But what I will do now is name my book of the month and then move on to some channel news. Wow, this is not easy. I am, after all, having to decide between 3 writers, 2 of whom won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Hamsun and Pirandello, but it has to be Heinrich von Kleist for the presence within that collection of Michael Kohlhaas, a story I shall never tire of returning to. So, March's book of the month is The Marquise of O and Other Stories by Heinrich von Kleist. I've since discovered there's a movie adaptation of this story starring, I believe, a gentleman who played a baddie in a James Bond film. I can't wait to check that out too. Such is my enthusiasm for this tale. Okay, time for some channel news, and then I shall bid you farewell. So in March, I switched to producing weekly rather than monthly wraps. The justification was that the rhythm of my life had changed. Now the semester has started and I'm taking classes again. It seemed to make sense to provide these weekly updates. However, making those videos themselves is taking up too much time better spent producing reviews and bookshelf tours and my Thomas Bernhard series for the channel. And so today I'll announce that I'm going to abandon that experiment and return to only producing monthly wraps. There, I've said it. And now all that remains is for me to bid you farewell. So be safe, be strong, and I shall see you anon. Nanu nanu.